Hello everyone, I'm Agnese and I'm a PhD student in KMi, where I also coordinate the KMi Maven of the Month initiative. In this episode, we're meeting Viola Schiaffonati. Viola is Associate Professor in Logic and Philosophy of Science at Politecnico di Milano. She also holds a PhD in Philosophy of Science from University of Genova, and she's had a really remarkable career, being a visiting researcher both at California, Berkeley and at Stanford. Last but not least, she's one of the members of the expert group that the European Commission has put together on the topic of AI and data for education and training. Let's hear from Viola then on computer, robots and experiments. I hope you enjoyed this episode. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Viola to our virtual stage today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Agnese and Enrico. Thank you for having invited me today. I'm very happy. And now I'll try to share my screen and my slides. Okay. Okay, so, and I hope you can see my screen now. Okay, so thank you very much. Today I will discuss in general about computers, robots, and in particular experiments. And I'll try to show that in the current ethical discussion on the ethical issues of artificial intelligence and robotics in particular, it's important to add an epistemic dimension. And then I will explain hopefully in a clearer way what I mean. So I think that we can start with examples that everybody knows because they are basically on the news every day. And these examples are just telling us how artificial intelligence and robotics are today into our daily life. And they will be even more in the future, and how they raise a number of ethical and social issues. Just the example of the self-driving cars and the discussion about the responsibility and decision in the case of unavoidable accidents, but also examples related to the current surveillance societies in which we live and how this surveillance affect our individual privacy, but also our democracies in a way. Another example, this is perhaps less well known, but very important and with a very strong impact, the use of autonomous weapon systems in the current warfare scenarios, and how the autonomy and the increasing autonomy they have is already having an impact on the warfare scenarios and the ethical issues related. But there are also many examples in the cases in which, for example, traditional human decision-making is substituted with machine decision-making, like, for example, trials and judgment, and how this is impacted with the advent of machine learning, in particular machine learning tools. And this is my last example, but I think it's also very important how the current world of jobs is changing with the introduction of tools, programs, and algorithms that are able to, let's say, substitute workers, not like traditional robots substituting workers in the factories, but substituting workers in their intellectual activities. So this is just to tell that we have, of course, we are living exciting times, but at the same time, we are living times in which because of these technologies, we have to face many challenges. And today, I'd like to focus on one of these challenges. That is a very general challenge. So the idea that these technologies do not develop by themselves. We, develop them, we can decide, and we have to decide, and we want to have these technologies in accordance with human values and needs. And you know, probably that this is much debated in the current field of the ethics of technology and in particular the ethics of artificial intelligence. But today, I would like to provide a partially different perspective. So first of all, what's the problem in this current scenario? There are many problems, of course, but what's the problem when we focus on intelligent and autonomous systems? Okay, that's just another name to call artificial intelligence and robotics, emphasizing their intelligence. Of course, this is difficult to define what we can mean by intelligence, and their autonomy. But we'll discuss more on this later. And they are special under many circumstances. Today in this talk, I will focus on one, or better, 1.5 circumstances that is special. So the first one is that these technologies are special in the sense that it's not always possible to anticipate the effects of their introduction in society. So I will discuss about the epistemic uncertainty that is related to these technologies. And this is an impact also on the fact that these technologies are, I would say, very risky, very impactful. And so it is very important to try to develop them in a way that is possible to reverse negative effects or to step back from their development when it's not already too late. So in a sense, this is a way to try to mitigate their risk. So my general claim, my central claim in this talk is that to try to address the challenge that I described, we need to add an epistemic dimension to the ethical reflections that are currently under discussion. Okay? And now I'll try to clarify better what I mean by this epistemic dimension. Let me just tell you my plan for today. I will discuss this epistemic dimension, and in particular, I will focus on the idea that we need to introduce a partly different idea of experimentation when we discuss about AI and robotics. And this is the idea of explorative experimentation that is, in a sense, it's the core of my work as philosopher of science and technology. But this is important because this has an impact not only at the epistemic level, but also at the ethical one. And so the idea is that as in the same way that we need new epistemical categories like the idea of explorative experiments, we have also to revise the traditional moral principles that guide experimentation in the case of AI and robotics. But to make my discussion a little bit more concrete, I will focus on a particular application, okay? And then I'll try to enlarge a little bit the framework. So the particular application is a field of robotics that is called search and rescue robotics, and in which basically the goal is to have robot systems that operate in some environments after disastrous events. This is an area of robotics that is very interesting because, in a sense, it combines the idea that here robots can support the job of human rescuers, and they can do this in different ways, like assessing the state of environments or detecting or rescuing victims in these environments. And it's interesting that in this context, robots with different degrees of autonomy are employed because, I mean, it's important to have robots that are able to operate in very harsh and unpredictable environments. So in a sense here, we introduce the idea of autonomous robotics that, again, it's a field within robotics and in which the idea of autonomy is that here robots do not require continuous human supervision. I'm aware that probably this definition of autonomy is a little bit too simple, but it's important to keep it this simple and not just to move to this problem. Perhaps we can discuss more during the questions. And autonomous robots have several applications. One of these applications is the search and rescue context. Okay, let's focus on the fact that in these environments, there are different levels of uncertainty in this kind of application. And I will emphasize at least two levels of uncertainty. So the first one is that these artifacts, these autonomous robots, are complex from a technical point of view. And in particular, they are also complex if we consider that to achieve this level of autonomy, machine learning techniques are adopted, okay? But there is another level of difficulty, which is the uncertainty that is related to the environment. Please remember that these robots have to interact with a complex environment. And in this environment, there are other technical artifacts, so other robots and human beings, okay? Because this is something that can happen in search and rescue scenarios. And so interaction is difficult and uncertain. So how does this uncertainty impact on this scenario, and in particular keeping search and rescue scenario in mind? It impacts because it makes very difficult, sometimes even impossible, to anticipate and to predict the possible issues arising in that particular scenario. So here we have a level of difficulty in the case, think for example of a case of an environment after a disaster. Not only robots don't know the environment in general, but then this environment has been completely or partially changed because of the disaster. So what I think is important in this kind of scenario that is representative of the scenarios in which autonomous robots are employed and applied is that when we want to know how these systems, these robots really work, is necessary to introduce and to test them in real context. This is really important. I'm not arguing that this is not valid in general for other technical artifacts. I'm saying that this case is particularly important because the usual possibility of prediction, the usual possibility of anticipation become very difficult in this context. So in a sense, these activities can be labeled as experimental. They are experiments, but not in the traditional sense of the word. And why? This is at least for two reasons. The first is that here the goal is not to prove any theory, like in the traditional control experiments. And the second is that the control over the experimental conditions, that again is one of the central tenets of traditional experimentation, in this case is very limited because there is no previous knowledge of the environment, there is difficult knowledge of the possible interaction, and so on. So in my previous work, I have claimed that in these cases, we cannot adopt the traditional idea of control experiment. That has been one of the pillars of modern science in a sense, but that in these cases, we have to introduce this idea of explorative experimentation. So I'm not arguing that all all the experiments in artificial intelligence and robotics are labeled as explorative experimentation, okay? I'm saying that in some circumstances and some type of experimentation in artificial intelligence and robotics is this explorative experimentation. So it's not a way to substitute control experimentation, is a way to, let's say, add another type of experimentation in the case of artificial intelligence and robotics. So explorative experimentation is a different type of experiment. And here you can find a definition of epistemic or control experiment, which has usually the goal to provide us with information about the workings of the world in we live in. Okay, and this idea of experimentation played a major role in science, and now also in the starting from the last century in the philosophy of science. But there are other forms of experiments, and the form on which I'm focusing now is a form of, let's say, experimentation that is a technological form of experimentation, a technological form of experimentation driven by practical needs. So I'm not the only one to argue that other forms of experimentation different from the control or epistemic experiment exist. This is a very nice book in which this idea of technological forms of experimentation has been reconstructed also from a historical point of view, showing that these technological forms of experimentation were kind of common also during pre-scientific times, okay? But what's new in my case is that I apply this idea of explorative experiments to the case of artificial intelligence and robotics, and in general to some experiments in computer engineering. So one of the so let me just tell you a little bit about the features of these explorative experiments. Surely one important feature that is different from the traditional idea of epistemic or control experiment is that these explorative experiments test technical artifacts. And technical artifacts are physical objects with a technical function and a use plan designed by humans. And this makes an important difference because this makes the idea that experiments in this context are carried out to check whether these artifacts meet the desired specifications, the design specification via their technological production. So in these experiments, for example, here you can see there's a sort of normative element that is important and plays an important role. Then another feature is that the experimental factors that is core element of traditional experimentation here in explorative experiments cannot be fully controlled from the beginning. But these factors can be controlled sometimes only after the insertion of the artifacts into the environment. So I'm not saying that control is completely disappeared, because I think that control plays an important role in experimentation, any type of experimentation. I'm just arguing that it's another form of control, okay? And there is another feature that is important for our discussion is that these experiments are not made to prove or to reject a general theory, but to probe in a sort of iterative way the possibilities and limits of the technical artifacts in a particular context. Okay, so let me move to the last part of my presentation, which is how do we move from epistemology to ethics? What I argue for explorative experiment can play a role for the ethical discussion. And the point here is that if we go back to the idea that it's not always possible to anticipate and predict the ethical issues and social impacts of autonomous and intelligent systems, what I'm saying is that this epistemic uncertainty, in a way, um, influences the ethical ideas, and in particular, what I call ethical incrementalism. And I will explain later what I mean. So let me add just another definition, but this is a definition that it's helpful for what I'm going to propose, and this is the idea of experimental technologies. Experimental technologies are defined as technologies whose risks and benefits not only are difficult to estimate, but sometimes are unknown. And I think it's useful to apply this idea of experimental technologies for sure to robots for search and rescue for the context that we have seen. Why is it important to label these as experimental technologies? It is important because we can apply this framework. This is an ethical framework that has been developed for experimental technologies. And it's interesting because it starts from the traditional principles of bioethics like non-maleficence, beneficence, respect for autonomy and justice, and implements these principles into 16 conditions that exactly are devised for experimental technologies. So for very special type of technologies whose impact is very difficult to predict, and sometimes it's impossible. So is it possible to apply this framework, this ethical framework, to the case of robotics, and in particular to the case of search and rescue robotics? Yes, this is possible. I have done this process with a colleague coming from robotics, and we have tried to consider each of the conditions and see how these conditions apply to the case of search and rescue robotics. I will just tell you some examples to move quickly to the conclusion. Here is a case of, let's say, a positive application of the condition, but then later on I will show you a negative or a difficult case. So, for example, let's consider condition number 3. Condition number 3 says that in these cases of the experimental technologies, it should be always possible to adapt or to stop the experiment. So this can be easily done in the case of search and rescue robotics, because you can design robots with a very big red button for which, for example, victims, if they don't want to be rescued by robots, they can just push this button, and then, or if they are harmed by the robot, they just can push the button and say, and stop the robot. But there are cases that are, let's say, more difficult to be adapted in the case of search and rescue robotics. Like, for example, condition number 14 that says that vulnerable experimental subjects should be particularly protected. This is difficult because in search and rescue applications, victims are particularly vulnerable, and there's no way, or so far there's no way to protect them or to respect this condition. This is important to try to evidence both the positive aspects, but also the difficulties of applying these ethical frameworks to the case of search and rescue robotics is important, because it tells us that some ethical issues cannot be solved by design. It's true that some of these conditions can be solved with the appropriate design, like the red button that I was mentioning before, or like, for example, privacy issue that can be partly solved by design. But there are other conditions that cannot be solved in this way and require a sort of incremental interaction between design and experimental activities. And in particular, for example, condition 4 and condition 7 that in a sense say that risk should be contained and larger scale harm should be avoided. Why these conditions cannot be solved by design? They cannot be solved by design because, in a sense, we have to recognize the epistemic uncertainty that I was mentioning before. So to recognize this epistemic uncertainty is central to mitigate risk and to adopt an ethical incremental approach. That means that, in a sense, these technologies should be released into the environment in a gradual way, okay? So let me conclude and say that we have seen by discussing the case of search and rescue robotics, but that in general, in some areas of artificial intelligence and robotics, anticipation is not always possible, and prediction is extremely difficult. So to recognize this epistemic uncertainty and to adopt the idea of explorative experimentation is very important, because these explorative experiments are needed to gain knowledge about the behavior of the robots in the real world, in that particular scenario. But it's also important that this idea of explorative experimentation impacts on the ethical issues as well, because the moral principles for experiments in the natural sciences need to be reconsidered and needs to be revised under the idea of risk mitigation and gradual introduction of these technologies into the context of application. This is a way to say that the experimental technologies are gradually introduced into society, to constantly monitor their effects, and also to use this monitoring to improve in an iterative way their design. So that's all, and I thank you all very much, and I'm ready to answer your question.
Thank you, Viola. Thank you very much. I think this is all really interesting and groundbreaking also. Like, my opinion is that we don't hear, especially in machine learning and AI, we don't hear this other perspective enough. And I think this brings me to a question I wanted to ask you, that is, like, especially, I think as long as pattern recognition has been automated, we've seen this almost race to beat the previous benchmark and producing this paper that have to demonstrate that some progress on benchmarks. And in your book, Computer Robot Esperimenti, you talk about this in terms of creating this illusion of progress in AI that sometimes is detached from the real world. And so how do you think we should, or if you think we should revolutionize our benchmarking practices today?
No, this is it's a very interesting, but also very difficult question. Of course, I don't know exactly, because this revolutionizing this kind of practice requires many different elements. What I think is very important, and again, my perspective is the perspective of a philosopher of science and technology. I think it's very important that to recognize that, in a sense, there's not just a single way to conceive experimentation. I see this as a problem because there are many papers and then many, let's say, research behaviors that stem from these papers and from this kind of attitude that tries to just describe experimentation as any type of experimentation, for example, in computer engineering, as a controlled form of experimentation. And this means that, in a sense, this is a way of recognizing, of trying to make the scientific experimental practice, let's say, more systematic and rigorous, but then in reality, so this is a way to, let's say, reread reality in a sense, because then in reality it's not true that all the form of experimentations, in particular in computer engineering, are controlled experiments. So I think it's very important, first of all, to recognize that we have to move from considering or trying to adapt the experimental methods of computer engineering to the experimental method of physics, for example. They are different realms of knowledge, and I think that the engineering sciences are different from the natural sciences under many respects. And the first point is to recognize this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think we have a few questions in the queue. So I'll start with Pasquale. Pasquale, you ask first the question, then I think a second. The next was John, and then Enrico. Pasquale, you go first.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the talk. So I have two questions, if I may ask them. So the first question is about the so-called esperimenti mentali. I'm sorry, I don't know the exact translation in English, so
it's
I use the
thought
Italian.
experiment.
Thought experiment, exactly. Okay, so is there still space for thought experiments in this explorative framework, especially in environment that are known? So you have spoken of search and rescue robots, but I'm thinking of robots that we send on other planets, for instance, or something like that. This is the first question. And the second question, if I may ask, is what do you think is the role of symbolic AI methods in the future as opposite to probabilistic method applied to ethics? Thank you very much.
Thank you for these questions. Yes, I do think that there's space for thought experiment. Of course, I'm a little bit afraid of this because, you know, thought experiments are widely used in philosophy. But then in the tradition of science, they have been used also in science. If you think of Galileo Galilei, but is also Einstein and other very famous scientists. But I think that this part on thought experiments, I think is very useful, not in the framework of explorative experiment, but in general in the framework of thinking about science and technology and their development. And I would say that, for example, imagination, that's a way to also frame thought experiment, but imagination in a sort of constrained way is a very good way, for example, to think of possible unintended consequences when developing a technology. So, for example, just to mention, we have at Politecnico di Milano, we introduced some years ago a course for PhD students on imagination, giving them scientific background on imagination, but also having a professional certified coach working with them on imagination and exercising on imagination. Because I do think that imagination is very important, not just for scientific purposes, but also for moral analysis. And the second question, of course, this is a super question, very difficult, and I don't know how to answer. But I think that in a sense, again, because my background as a philosopher of science works in answering this question, and I do think that symbolic methods will have a role. Probably the challenge is to integrate symbolic methods with other more probabilistic ones. But we have seen that it's not true that this is the end of the theory in a sense. And so we still do need theories, and we still do need, let's say, symbolic methods to represent knowledge in this way.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Viola, for the very interesting questions. And yeah, just a quick comment before I hand over to John for the next question. It's really great to hear your comments about essentially computer engineering being an exploratory kind of enterprise, and you cannot apply these classic rigid experimental frameworks the same way that maybe you can apply it to other sciences. I think we've all been kind of the receiving end of epistemological rigid reviewers, so it's really great. Really great to hear that. Okay, John, over to you.
Hi, Viola. Thank you very much for your talk. I would echo what Enrico said first. Back when I was doing my PhD in the 80s, it would have been very helpful to have your framework around. KMi, as you probably know, is a research and innovation lab for the Open University, helping us teach our 200,000 students. So, and I was reflecting heavily on your talk about our journey as a lab. We're 25, 26 years old in introducing AI to the OU. And I would say for us that there's a balance between, let's say, I would call on the one side hype, and on the other side Frankenstein. In general, the education sector is extremely laggard. It's in between laggard and really the people that destroy machines. So I think there's an importance to be balanced between those two. And when you were talking about gradual introduction, I was smiling to myself because we've been trying to introduce this technology since 2000, and we're getting there. So we now have a plan in the latest strategy for the Open University, which just came out for the next 5 years. It's decided in the next 5 years it will start officially introducing AI. There are some AI systems. So I guess my first question, it's really a two-part question in relation to the, let's say, connecting to other stakeholders in the world is how does one balance between the hype and scaring people off? I've seen, for example, often people around my institution, others will say, oh no, we can't do that because of GDPR. And now I might worry that they'll say, oh, we can't do that because of some concerns. The other is, so your framework is a fabulous one for anyone in computer science and AI. And as I said, I echo Enrico's comments. But in the end, my bosses, so I'm the director of KMi, but my bosses and my boss's boss, the vice chancellor, they only ever care about the impact on the world. So in a sense, they never care about the technology at all, what it does. They want to say there's an impact on students. Are they, are their grades being increased? Are we getting more students? So I guess it's two parts. How do we not scare off our stakeholders, and how do we try to ensure when we do these experimentation? And I've actually, one of the things I've tried to explain across the OU is every single teaching episode should be an experiment. And now I'll add your part. It should be an explorative experiment, because it is. Because we teach at scale. Some of our courses have thousands of students. So how do we hook in? Oh yes, as you're funding me, we can also say this is ethical and important for the core business of whatever core business I'm in.
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you so much. And it's a great question because this is exactly what I'm, let's say, not just thinking, but living in those days. And the idea of, let's say, of incrementalism and gradual introduction, and the idea that you experiment, but you are in a context in which if you realize that there are issues, you can change, move back, then redesign, and then experiment again. But then having this kind of experimental approach, I think it's very important, because I do think that it's not enough that, okay, you think, let's say already from the beginning, when you design a technology, of the, let's say, values that you want to incorporate into a technology. Okay, that's great. I think that we did, in a sense, as a society, many important steps in this direction. Now, most of the people recognize that it's important already to think about of values, for example, already at the design level, but it's not enough. It's not enough in particular when you are dealing with technologies like artificial intelligence. And so you have to have this sort of incremental approach. I'm really working hard in the expert group of the European Commission. I'm a representative of a very large association in Europe, which is Informatics Europe. And and this is a group of experts that the European Commission set up. We are 25 experts working exactly on the idea of having guidelines for artificial intelligence and data in education and training. But we do think that it's not enough to have just these guidelines as to say, okay, our technologies should be trustworthy, and then we should be develop them such that they can be explicable and so on. I think that the next step is to, again, try to stay with these values, but then see how these values work when they are implemented into a particular context. And education, I think, is one of, let's say, the most important contexts in which it's, I mean, students, children, they are particularly vulnerable. So we do have to care much more than perhaps in any other cases. So it's a great, I mean, it's a challenge. I don't know exactly how that we can solve this, but I think it's very important to have this sort of incremental approach.
Ooh.
Okay, I think Enrico is next, and then Advait. Enrico, do you want to unmute?
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I'm just wondering whether. So my question is about the complexity of those systems. So that clearly, as you beautifully explained, we can only understand how's the impact of these complex systems if we run experimentations in the wild, incremental, and so forth. However, when we do our research, we work on isolated problems, and these complex systems are usually orchestrates a huge amount of different components. So I was wondering if you have any perspective on how this framework can feed back in the methodologies of researchers that have necessarily focused concerns. So how you this such a holistic approach may help design better experiments at a vertical level on each one of the specific components, or combining multiple components. So we do, for example, ablation studies, to understand how small changes in a component may have an impact on the final performance. But clearly, what you're pointing out is a much more complex problem.
And thank you so much for this question. To be honest, I don't know exactly. I mean, that's great. It's true. In a sense, this idea of holistic kind of experimentation is then the idea that you do experiments in the real context, because the problem is that, as you know, you don't have just a unique theory that is able to perhaps not explaining, but anyway, predicting or framing all the problems, and there are different pieces. So the possibility is to try to just collect from experience these different parts and then put them together. But honestly, I don't know how to. I'm not even sure that there's just a single way to put them all together, but it's very interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the talk.
Okay, Advait, do you want to ask next?
Thanks, Viola, for a very thought-provoking talk. I should start by saying I don't work in robotics, but your talk did get me to reflect on some exasperation I felt about the way evaluations happen in my research community and how. And I think the general trend within my area of AI, at least, has been towards automating evaluations using standard tasks, standard data sets, so that you can compare models in a fair way. And it's also so that you can show to DARPA and other funders that you're making progress, your systems are getting better in some objective manner. So, of course, these evaluations don't consider risk at all. If you think about accuracy or precision or recall, it's about the percentage of mistakes, not how problematic the mistakes are. And so I wonder, though everything you say makes sense, whether it'll actually get taken on board, because by not controlling the experiment, you basically negate the way people have been, the way progress has been happening. In academia, of course, if you're a company, then you are risk averse for other reasons. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
No, I totally agree with you. It's true. But then it's difficult because I guess one of the reasons is that if you stay in the idea that you have ways of objectively evaluate something and then have ways of measuring and so on, of course, you are in a sense more scientific. I guess that's one of the problems. And one of the problems in particular I see in computer science is that computer science is young, and then at the beginning was just like, let's say, made by practitioners and hackers, how people called themselves at that time. So this idea that you have to evaluate, you have to have rigorous experimentation, to have objective ways of doing this practice, I think it's partly, or can be partly, related to the idea of, let's say, as you can find in some old papers, researchers having the idea to be taken more seriously, to be considered scientists in the real sense of science. So adding a sort of judgment in this kind of using of these labels. So I think it's interesting that I mean, I'm a philosopher of science, and usually philosophers of science, sometimes they are a little bit, let's say, detached from reality sometimes. But here, I think it's a wonderful problem in which we see that science and technology are deeply connected to reality and to the people and to the practice and to all these elements that sometimes philosophy of science doesn't recognize fully. And I think the problem is nice here because there are all these elements together.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Viola. So I don't see any hands raised or more questions in the chat. So I will actually ask the next question. So actually, the interesting thing was, yeah, you can see there is a little bit of pent-up frustration, certainly in a few people around this event about, as I said, epistemological rigid reviewers, and not even individual reviewers, but yeah, there are. I mean, I read what you wrote about, for example, the role of benchmarks, this illusion that, as long as you comply with the benchmarks, you have made progress, which we all know very well is not true in many cases. So yeah, thank you very much for giving us, a way to sort of get rid of some frustration by, talking to a philosopher of science that says, yeah, you guys are right. There are more ways to do things. So I wanted to go back to this process that you talk about, this explorative experimentation, because basically you seem, your framework seems to focus more on the process in a sense than the outputs. In a sense, is again what Advait was saying about, at the end of the day, we just want to limit the number of mistakes. And so certainly, for example, in most experiments we do when we deploy artifacts or robots, but also other systems that perform in a concrete societal environment. At the end of the day, you have performance measures. So in a sense, so I have basically two questions. One question is that, yeah, I was expecting to hear something about performance and tasks and essentially, degree of fit with whatever, if your robot has to rescue people, at the end of the day, if that robot rescues people, that's a good achievement. If it doesn't, that's not so good. That's the first question. And the other thing that is these. I mean, again, you have these interesting concepts like the use of imagination, and I wonder whether there is again a link. You emphasize this primarily in the context of ethical frameworks, but I wonder again whether there is a link also to the experimentation activity as well. So the second question, I think I'm not even clear if I understand the question. But the first question I understand very well. What's the role of performance and outcomes in your framework?
This is a central role. I'm sorry, I was a little bit, let's say, too fast in that part, but it's essential. I agree with you. And it's I mentioned when I was defining technical artifacts as having a technical function. So this is essential because then when you make experiments, the goal is to see whether the real artifacts meet this technical function. That is basically the goal for which the artifact has been built. Okay, so there's a way, and there are, of course, different ways to try to measure whether the technical function has been met by that particular artifact. This is very important because also this makes the experimental context very different, because then if you are in this context, you can say, okay, this artifact is good or is bad. Then you can have plenty of ways of measuring in different ways, but there's a normative judgment in this. You evaluate the technical artifacts with respect to the technical function that is, let's say, elaborated into the design of the artifacts. This is very different from traditional control experiments in which, for example, when you are experimenting on an electron and trying to see whether the behavior of the electron is, and if, let's say, there's a theory that can explain this behavior, the object of the experiment, that is the electron, is not evaluated with respect to any function. The object is not good or bad. Then perhaps the theory can be labeled as good or bad, but the object, the natural object itself, is not labeled, is not evaluated as good or bad. And in my perspective, this is a very important difference. The evaluation of the technical function, that is one of the reasons why the artifact has been built, to try to fulfill this technical function. So how this at least partially answer your question. And the second question about the imagination, I think that, I mean, imagination is very important. Then of course it's difficult. And then, also, if you look back to the history of science, you clearly recognize that imagination has played and plays a role in science. But then again, you cannot define clearly, you cannot measure it clearly, then it's then sometimes better, or in a sense it's easier to just to put aside and try to have more, let's say, objective processes and so on. But then again, I think it's interesting to see how there's a gap between, let's say, the actual practice of science and technology and the way they are described, which is sometimes quite different from the actual practice.
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, I would say that the greatest people I've met in the world of science, they all seem to be driven far more by imagination than let's say other method, other more robust methodologies. They imagine something, then they worry how to achieve. Agnese, over to you. Do you have more questions?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to really ask one last question about what you mentioned when you were saying that in a way your practice has been very different from other philosophers in your field, and you always put this attention in grounding your work in collaboration with colleagues in AI, computing. And I think what would be really inspiring to hear from you for fellow researchers who are trying to approach this field from an interdisciplinary point of view. And also, I think because we're trying to attract as many people as possible from different fields in this event, like what would your advice be? And have you experienced in your career some resistance from different subfields of AI or philosophy, something you want to share?
Yes, sure. It's a great question. I mean, now we are living in a context in which interdisciplinary is very important, and also there is a momentum for AI and the ethical issues of AI and so on. But I started my PhD in 2000, and then I mean, artificial intelligence was not even more, let's say, a label, not used anymore in a sense. It was really out of fashion. But then I was really interested as a philosopher of science to stay in a lab, to work with scientists. And so the reason why I also started working in this artificial intelligence and robotics laboratory at Politecnico di Milano already back in those years. And this is because I think, and I have some, let's say, also mentors that thought that philosophers of science should be staying to the labs rather than in the parlors. And now is more common. There's, I mean, a lot of interest, a lot of young, very young and brilliant philosophers of science working this way. There's also less skepticism. I have to say that I was basically the only philosopher in my university for many years, and then also still the only one in my department in computer engineering. But it's nice that now we have some postdocs in different departments at Politecnico di Milano coming from philosophy and sociology. So there's less skepticism, more openness, and also, let's say, people working in science and technology have recognized that, let's say, at least ethics is important. Then perhaps they still don't recognize that, let's say, other fields like epistemology, philosophy of science, or sociology, they are still a little bit reluctant because, you know, ethics is easy to understand that we need to address these ethical issues. But I'm very, let's say, I'm not an optimist in this sense because I've seen many things have changed, and I guess that in the next few years they will even change more.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much also for this last note of hope for the future. And if there aren't any more questions, I don't see any in the chat or any hands raised. Okay, so yeah, I'll start by thanking so much Viola for joining us today, giving us 1 hour of her time. We're very grateful for it. And thanks to all of you for joining this event. And we'll...
Thank you. Thank you for your questions and for this nice interaction. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. See you at the next Maven of the Month event then. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.